Hi, I'm Deborah Hamilton. Welcome to my podcast, Why Do Pets Matter? 10 years ago, with my iPhone and a script, I recorded the first episode of the Ultimate Pet Resolution Summit, which chatted with experts about conflicts over animals. Our conversations were intimate, honest, and illustrated how disagreements over animals occur and how those disagreements can reshape people's lives and relationships. In November 2019, I started Why Do Pets Matter, a new podcast that continued these informative discussions. I'm so excited to have you here with me, continuing my exploration into a more meaningful conversation about why pets matter to all of us. My guests and I will share ideas, stories, and experiences straight from the heart, unscripted and holistic. From the bravest moments to the most brokenhearted, we will explore how to resolve disagreements over animals differently. One thing I know for sure is I want to have more meaningful conversations that will help all of us unlock that deeply felt human-animal bond that drives the emotions of conflict. Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk to Elizabeth Stutz. She's an attorney colleague of mine in Virginia, and we've had several discussions about microchips and the benefits and drawbacks of microchips, because we might think they are the end all and the be all. However, they are only as good as the information that's on them and the scanning that's done of them. And then we're going to talk about some of the vagaries of whether or not everyone scans for microchips. So let's hear what Elizabeth and I talk about today involving microchips. Hi, everyone. Deborah Hamilton and the Why Do Pets Matter podcast. I'm here with Elizabeth Stutz. She's a good friend and an attorney who helps people resolve conflicts over animals with veterinarians, whatever comes in our sphere of pet services. I'm so glad she's here. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
I am so glad you're here as well. I cannot believe that we have so many things to speak about of interest, but the first one we're going to do is, of course, the first question I ask every guest. Elizabeth, why do pets matter to you?
Well, I come from this, first of all, as I was a biology major, so I think of all of us as being animal species, and our planet is diverse, and we're just one of the animals among animals. And so, of course, animals are important. I think pets in particular are important to me, and I think to most people, because they bring out, I think they most frequently bring out the best in us. They help us with empathy, with sympathy, with nonverbal communication. They teach us that we're not always the most important person or being. They teach children responsibility. They teach children to care about a being that is maybe less powerful than they are. I think a home without pets is not a home to me, but then I'm a little bit biased.
I know I'm biased as well. I always told my kids they were so lucky their mother liked dogs, because they had like 6 or 8 of them all the time. And it was quite a menagerie. And both of them actually do have pets now. So it's interesting. So Elizabeth, I'd love to ask you a little bit about how your love for pets impacted how you started your practice.
I initially thought that I might go to vet school, and I worked for a veterinarian who was very old school at the time. Oh, the practice is changing. I don't think you're going to like it by the time you get there, that sort of thing. And I got a bit dissuaded from that. And then I became interested in environmental law. And then I thought, well, I've always liked medicine too. Maybe I can combine science and law. So, and also because I enjoy communicating with people. So, and learning different things. And my practice has really, with very few exceptions over the years, has combined science and law.
And, that's such an important piece.
Well, so anyway, in animal science to me is the most important and most interesting science. So anytime that I was able to assist a veterinarian or to be involved with, say, a horse sale transaction or anything that could bring in my sort of outside knowledge of horses and animals, I did that.
It always is funny how that happens. I wanted to be a veterinarian as well. Chemistry got me, so that's what made me pivot into
It
the
did
law.
me too. Of
I
course,
was
the
better.
partying and the chemistry together, I think, was probably part of the problem. But
Exactly. So I said, well, I'm not necessarily going to excel in this, so I might as well figure out how I can buy a horse as opposed to become a horse veterinarian. That's what I wanted to do.
yeah.
So it's interesting, though, there are so many things that are misunderstood in the world of pet ownership that we take for granted. And you and I have actually had a conversation about the requirements of anyone who picks up a pet who has a microchip. So I wanted to talk today with you because we've had this conversation. I love the back and forth that we've had. And I think my listeners are going to really be interested in understanding what they believe is true about microchips and what they might not understand about microchips. So tell me a little bit about your experience with microchips and how they are required scanning or not required scanning, depending on who you are.
Well, the first thing I think that I would say about microchips is that they are overwhelmingly a good idea. To have your pet there's really no reason to not have your pet microchipped, cat, dog, any sort of mammal, ferret, I guess, anything that could escape or get out of your control. It's a good idea to have them microchipped. It's a very, in the scheme of things, generally inexpensive procedure. It's a procedure that has very little risk, although there is some risk. Obviously, anytime you have an invasive procedure, it's usually, I think, about a 12 gauge or 18 gauge needle. The microchip itself is about the size of a grain of rice, so it's very small. But of course, anytime you have an invasive procedure, there's the risk of infection. There's also really the only downside that I could find is that there are a few studies that pets that have been microchipped have developed different types of cancers in the area where the microchip was inserted. It's statistically very, very small. So I think it's probably not a significant risk, but it is out there. Overwhelmingly, however, microchips reunite lost pets with people. If you go on Home Again, which is the largest manufacturer of microchips, you can go on their site, and I think it says to date 3 million pets have been reunited with their owners and counting. So it is really, I think, if you have pets, essential that you get them microchipped. Now, people say, well, I don't need to have my pet microchipped. I live in an apartment in New York. My cat never goes outside. Or my dog is very well trained, or we have collars on all of our animals. And microchipping and collars are not an either or proposition. You should have a collar and you should have a microchip. Not everybody, if your dog gets loose in a situation and somebody catches it, the average person doesn't have a scanner. If they've got a collar, the collar has an ID tag, that's the most obvious way of getting your pet back. And I have no tolerance for people who say cats won't wear collars, because they will. It's just whatever they get used to. So a collar should always be your first line of defense. But second of all, I've had people say, well, I never let my pet out, so why would I bother to microchip? Well, the air conditioning man comes in and leaves the door open, or you're traveling with your dog and you're at a rest stop and something happens and startles you and you drop the leash and it scares the dog and they run off. Or you have a natural disaster like a tornado. There are just many, many situations that you might not think about that could lead to your pet being lost. So having the microchip is very helpful. One common misperception about microchips is that they're somehow like a GPS, which they're not. So the way the microchip works is that it's inserted underneath the skin. No anesthetic is really necessary. The veterinarian will take the skin above the shoulder blades and kind of tent the skin up, and then take a syringe and insert the microchip. It's that simple. It's no more painful than a vaccine, really.
So glad you said that, because a lot of people are a little worried that it's going to be painful. And I'm just so interested in understanding that there's a small percentage that have a reaction to it. Sometimes it's just a benign tumor. Sometimes it can create cancer. The other thing that I've heard is that sometimes with age, it can migrate. And
This
so
is true.
if in fact you have one, you should always remind the veterinarian to go up the right leg, down the left leg, through the back, wherever, because sometimes they're found in the chest, in the front of the chest, and a bunch of other places, correct?
That's true. They do. And so the generally accepted area is the area, the shoulder blades behind the neck. And it's because, for one thing, it's an area that the animal can't groom easily. And it's usually will be stabilized by the shoulder blades. The microchip can migrate. And if it migrates, and somebody's scanning, looking for it in the shoulder blade area, and it's migrated to wherever it's gone, then it's not going to help. I don't know what the percentage is of microchips that migrate. I think it's probably not terribly high.
It's like less than 1%, but they do migrate. So veterinarians, I think, and most shelters will scan shoulder blades left and right, and hopefully take, a good scan, because you really want to make sure, if you've scanned your pet, that they find it. So hopefully they will do that.
Right.
And are horses chipped yet or not yet?
Well, I think in some instances, yes. But it is not something that it's not standard by any
it's not standard practice yet. Yeah, they're still identified on a list.
Horses have like, for example, racehorses, thoroughbred racehorses have a lip tattoo. There are other ways of identifying horses that are not feasible really for a smaller animal like a pet, and especially animals that have a thicker coat. The horse's coat is generally not so thick. So a brand is something that's easier to see. Let's see, the microchipping. Here's another thing to keep in mind is that if you look on the American Animal Hospital Association page, they kind of are the clearinghouse for information about these microchips. And there are many different manufacturers of microchips, and some are slightly different than others. All of them should be scanned and be, a number will come up.
Right.
And then that number, you can go to that registry and then, go backwards, or I should say the only people who can do this are veterinarians and people from shelters. But not every scanner can find every microchip. Like the Home Again scanner can find every microchip. But some of the scanners that are made by other manufacturers might not pick up microchips.
Right. So you have to make sure that they have the ability to be picked up by a universal scanner, that somebody doesn't have to have your microchip scanner, rather whoever has a scanner. So that's a good question that people need to ask their veterinarian before they get a microchip. Is this a universal microchip that if in fact they chip it, they scan it with any wand, it'll pop up?
Correct.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's really important, and it's such an easy thing to do. In fact, I send all my puppies home already chipped and already registered with the chip provider, because I want to make sure that if they get lost on their way home, perfect. When you said, they spook, they get away, they might have a collar on. You have to rely on the person not to want to keep that cute little puppy. So you want to make sure that you have a collar with their name. I always suggest tags are really good. Having a collar with your telephone number weaved in is even better, because then it doesn't fall off.
And with a reflective collar, even better.
Yep, because you really want to make
material with it weaved in.
Yeah, because you really want to make sure that you give your pet every chance to come home. So here we are talking about all the benefits of microchips, and what we really, as pet owners, have come to rely on as that absolute, right? If somebody finds my dog, it's going to get scanned, or cat, it's going to get scanned, it's going to get returned. And you and I, as attorneys, have found out that's not always the case.
Yes, it is not. So first of all, and let me give you another example, though, of a case where having a microchip really assisted somebody getting their animal back. And this was a case where a woman that I know of personally, who was in a car accident. And she was hit by a drunk driver. It was just at a stop sign. And the drunk driver just careened into her, and she was knocked unconscious. The car was tilted over, windows smashed. Her dog was very frightened and ran away and just kept running. And luckily was caught by somebody. And when they took the pet into their vet, because the dog had some lacerations, they did scan.
Yeah.
and we're able to go backwards. But just trying to give people examples of that there's so many things you can't anticipate where you might need a microchip. You can't just say, I'm responsible, my dog's always on a leash or whatever, because there's so many uncontrolled circumstances.
It's so
But
funny you
yeah,
say that, because my husband always says, oh, just let Junie off the leash. And my dog is really well behaved. And I said, he just has to not
until they see
listen
a
to me
squirrel.
once. He just has to not listen to me once. I said, and I'm not really
Exactly.
willing to test that in an unfenced area. I'm not. And I love him, and I know he'd love to be off free running. And sometimes it gets to me, but really you have to make sure that you have your pet in a completely secure environment. And our MAP community that meets on Wednesdays talks about just that issue, that if you have a car accident and the dogs are with you, what have you done to provide safety for them, and also to provide the care for them that they need if something happens to you? So it's fabulous that you brought that up, because if you're knocked unconscious, where does the dog go if he's still in the car because you drive with them in crates like I do? Or what happens if they get loose? I mean, you
Right.
should have something on the car that says, listen, I had a dog in this car. My dog is traveling with me. So if he's not here, please look for him, and he's, this or that. Or I have dogs at home if you're in a car accident, because we learned during COVID that a number of people didn't realize they'd be put on ventilators when they went to the hospital because they were sicker than they
Right.
thought. And then no one was caring for their pets, because it was supposed to be, I'm just going to go to the doctor and, come home. And that didn't happen. So you're
Right.
absolutely right. These microchips provide that peace of mind that if the dog is found, cat is found, and brought to a veterinarian or a shelter, that if you ask them to scan it to see if it has a chip, they will, at a veterinarian's office. Shelters and rescues usually scan them no matter what, whether you ask them or not. But therein lies a little bit of the misconception about how quickly or how often microchips are not scanned.
That is true. So as of today, there's a number of states, I'm looking over here at this list, that have passed a provision of some sort that either mandates that owners put microchips in their pets, and or that vets and humane societies and just public animal shelters scan if an animal comes in and the ownership is unknown. So apparently Hawaii, interestingly, was the first state to mandate that owners microchip their pets. So not only does their law apply to shelters and veterinarians, but also to animal owners. District of Columbia, Florida, Georgia, Hawaii, Illinois, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Texas all have some form of legislation. And here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we just in July of 2022 passed a Virginia law regarding microchipping. So what most of these laws say is that if an animal is presented either to a veterinarian or to a shelter, whether it's a private shelter or whether it's a government operated shelter, that they are required to scan for a microchip. Now, that doesn't mean that every pet is automatically scanned for a microchip. So this is where kind of the rub comes in. The case that you and I had talked about, where an individual cared for a stray cat for almost a year and didn't have the cat in her home, finally was able to get her hands on the cat, took the cat to the vet and said, we've been caring for this stray cat, and here's her name, and she's finally accepted us as her family, and we'd like to get her initial shots and whatever else she needs or whatever, and drops the cat off. Well, it turns out the cat is microchipped, and the microchip indicates ownership from someone else. So there begins a problem.
Right.
So there are a number of things.
So one of the problems I'm sure you're going to get to is that the law is specific about when veterinarians are supposed to scan a cat, and it isn't if it's brought in for vaccinations and for a shampoo. If someone comes in as the owner, the gray area here is that, at least in my understanding, is that the law is triggered if someone's releasing a pet.
Yes, it is. but it's also like the Virginia law, I think, has uses the term unknown. Now, I can't remember if that's exactly how it is, quoted, but it's if an animal's ownership is unknown. So what does that mean? For these people, they had cared for this cat for over a year. They had tried to get animal control involved. Nobody had responded. They posted signs. They'd done all sorts of stuff. So was the ownership of this animal really unknown at that point? So this is also where it can get very complicated depending on the jurisdiction. First of all, you've got your local ordinances, maybe not, relating to pet responsibility, pet ownership, pet relinquishment. Then you've got state laws that also apply to those things.
Yep.
And then state laws that apply to just general principles of property. And then you have laws that, generally have state laws that apply to animal husbandry, what means, what creates ownership and control of an animal, what creates statutory relinquishment of an animal. Like in Virginia, if you don't provide food or water for, I think it's 4 days, then you can be deemed to have relinquished ownership because you're not caring for your animal. And often these things don't all add up. You might have that the state, the municipal law says one thing, the state law says another. And then we have certain requirements. Some states and some localities have requirements that if you find a stray animal that you have to report within a certain period of time. And if you do report and nobody responds, then after a certain period of time, ownership is with the person who's caring for the animal. Right. So then enter, visit to the veterinarian.
Nobody ever thought of those laws with respect to what happens if enter veterinarian and scan happens.
Right. And, and somebody at the vet office hears stray and the description of the new pet, does the scanning, and then the scanning indicates that it is not the person who brought the pet in. So, what happens? And then that also brings in what we talked about earlier is the veterinary client patient relationship, the VCPR, which can be, a glorious thing and a bugaboo, depending on how it arises.
That's right. And how you're looking at it. Right.
Right. And from what perspective.
Yep.
So, what do? I recall having recently a conversation with a veterinary technician where she was involved in scanning an animal that was brought in, and it was being brought in to be euthanized. And so that's a lot of these statutes say that if an animal's brought in to be euthanized, then you should also scan to make sure.
Everybody understands that. Absolutely.
So, and in this case, by the time they figured out to whom the pet was registered, the person was incarcerated. And so there then came in, this whole debate about what the rights were of the incarcerated individual. And of course, when people are incarcerated, they really don't have any rights necessarily. They can't act as free citizens on a lot of things. And then also there is, it's not infrequent that the veterinarian or shelter worker may scan an animal and there's more than one microchip. I know that at our Richmond SPCA that's not an entirely infrequent occasion. So here's another thing to think about. You get a pet and you're responsible and you have it microchipped and you become ill and you can't take care of your pet. So you ask your best friend to take the pet for you. And then the best friend has the pet. And then, the best friend moves to California and you're in Virginia. I mean, if you don't keep up with the microchip is only as good as the information that is retained with the microchip. So there are instances where a microchip might say that the animal is registered to one person, when in fact, the person who has the animal rightfully has it. Like in the instance where someone is ill and says, will you please take care of my cat? And nobody thinks to change the registration for the microchip.
No, I know that perfectly. Yep, because I always am the first owner on all my puppies who go out. And yet I remain as the second owner on the microchips. They can re-register and be the primary owner, but I always have to be the secondary owner, and they may live in California, but then I know whose dog it is.
So that's a great thing to have the secondary registration. So I think that's another sort of misunderstanding, is that people feel like that the microchip itself is definitive of ownership, when in fact it's not. It's only one piece of information. It's
Yes,
obviously a rather persuasive piece of information, but it is only a piece of information.
absolutely.
So,
And that's the thing that you and I have talked at length about. What does ownership mean? How can you establish ownership? Well, now with the way the laws are changing, the microchip is one indicia of ownership. If the dog is given to you by a contract with a rescue, that's another indicia of ownership. I paid for the rescue fees, or I bought it from a breeder or a pet store. That's another indicia of ownership. But then it's also the pictures and the vet expenses that someone else might have been taking for a year and a half while they took care of your cat or not. And then it might just be the pictures of being with the cat all the time for a year and a half, and you don't have any pictures because the cat's been gone.
right. And it is very complicated. And I think it's also important, particularly for those who are listening who are pet owners, is to remember this. Under the laws of most states, not all, but under the laws of most states, the law of property ownership applies to pets.
Yes.
That's changing in a lot of areas, and it's a big area of debate, as both Deborah and I know. But currently in many jurisdictions, if you are to have a dispute about a pet, if you were to go into court and you were going to seek damages for either someone else taking that pet or harming that pet, that you were deprived of that pet, you would have to prove what that pet is worth. And what the pet is worth is not what the pet is worth to you.
Right. Right.
It's going to be, what is a stray cat worth, which is
Yeah.
probably whatever the adoption fee is at the local shelter. And that's just the way the law is. And there are many arguments.
Pain and suffering
In
and
favor of
emotional
that.
distress, not there yet.
Right. Yeah. And it depends, obviously under the circumstances, if somebody were to, we don't want to stray off too far into the subject,
Right.
but if somebody were to torture your pet in front of you, at least under Virginia law, you might be able to get something in addition, because
Yeah.
that's an intentional act.
And it's a
you could
criminal
have
act as well,
emotional
not
gain.
just
Right.
a taking of property, but it's a criminal
Right.
act because
It's a criminal act.
it's animal abuse. So it really is off topic on the microchip, but that only means, Elizabeth, you're going to have to come back because there's so much more that we have to talk about. I'm sure, like divorce as well, because if you microchip and both of your names are on the microchip, who gets the dog or the cat in divorce? It's a whole different thing that you need to really make sure you plan for when you get the pet, instead of when you're divorcing, because when you get the pet, you still like the person, usually.
And
Usually.
you know what? You're going to still like the pet at the end of it.
Yes, exactly. And the pet's still going to like
knows.
your ex, which is
Right.
really horrifying, because you really want them not to like your ex, but they do, because
Right.
that's the only other person they know. So, I mean, we're coming to the end. This went so quickly, I can't believe it. So the bottom line is that microchipping is a must, along with a collar with a tag or a weave name into it, so that your pet can be returned to you. And most of the time that works seamlessly. The only time that doesn't work seamlessly, I think, Elizabeth, you said, was if, there's a lot of time that goes on in between when you lose your pet and somebody might be caring for your pet. So then you have to look at the state law, the county law on what provides abandonment of your pet. So you haven't fed him in 5 days because you can't find him, but somebody's feeding him for 5 days. Does that dilute your ownership if you can't find him? Well, 5 days, 10 days, a month, maybe not. A year or so, there's something to be discussed there, because this person has been taking care of the pet. And of course, in my ADR world, I always say, well, that's good, because now you have an heir and a spare, so to speak. You have people who really love this pet. And so if something comes up, yes, you might fight for it, but then keep that person in your life, because they love the pet too. Go on vacation, whatever, the pet could go to them. So final thoughts, Elizabeth, in this is that, I think you said making sure that you have your pet microchipped is key, and making sure that you keep it up to date with where you are, who you are, is also key.
Yes, it is, because it's only as good as the information that's in the system. A lot of times, like you were saying, that when you with your puppies, that you put the microchip in initially. So often when animals are with a certain humane society, the information can always go back to the Humane Society. Then they can check their records and try to work from there. Another point is that generally, if an organization scans for the microchip, they're not going to just hand over the name to you. So then it's like, well, who adjudicates this, right?
Right.
So really, the best situation is that the animal goes to animal control with the two names of the people, and then let the government entity figure it out. It's not a good idea for example, a veterinarian to just take an animal from one person and hand it over to another, because that's not.
There's a lot of issues. We'll come back and talk about that too with the VCPR, because it really is sort of a no-no in vet school that you ever give a pet to someone on a microchip who isn't the person who brought the pet in. There are ways to handle that, respect everyone's position. And we have so much to talk about with microchips. Everybody probably thought this was cut and dry, put a microchip in, you're good to go. And you and I have now started them to think about what they need to do to make sure that that microchip works for them. And that if in fact they've lost a cat or dog for a year or something like that, or 2 years, and someone has taken care of it, that's what we'll talk about next time. What you might do instead of saying, wait, that's my dog or cat. Yes, that's my dog or cat, but recognize without these people caring for it, it wouldn't be in as good shape as it was. So that's our next talk, Elizabeth. We have so much to cover. I am so glad you're here. This is Elizabeth Stutz. Now, Elizabeth, how do they get in touch with you if they need you? Because you work out of Virginia, correct?
I do. So I wish I had an easy to remember website, but I don't. It's Elizabeth B, as in Butterworth, Stutts, ESQ.com. And my email is ebstutts@elizabethbstutts.esq.com.
Let's have your phone number.
It's area code 804-389-7323. And I am almost always available at that number.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to have those in the show notes. Elizabeth, I'm so glad you're here. We're going to have to think about carrying on this conversation, because there are ways in which to manage finding the wrong name on the microchip and using it in a way for good, as opposed to being judge and jury. But we'll talk about that next time, everyone. Until next time, this is Deborah Hamilton. Why Do Pets Matter? Thank you, Elizabeth Stutz, for coming. And we will see you on the next podcast. The Why Do Pets Matter podcast drops every Thursday and can be found on whichever platform you find your podcast. Subscribe now, invite your friends, and I cannot wait to have you join me in these conversations.